All right, we are back in the FITSNews studio for another edition of Your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, the founding editor and owner of FITSNews.com. A lot to dive into this week. Our Andy Fancher was back in the mountains of western North Carolina. He's going to bring you an update on the death toll, on the media coverage, and on what he has found in his travels to western North Carolina in the aftermath of the apocalyptic impact of Hurricane Helene. I'm also going to sit down this week with our Callie Lyons and Jen Wood. We're going to update you on several true crime stories we're following, the need for a strangulation law in South Carolina, according to advocates, and an update on the Micah Miller story. Lawsuits are imminent, folks. We're going to walk you through what we know of that process. Finally, with the presidential election less than 3 weeks away, I'm going to sit down with our Dylan Nolan. We're going to go through the very latest polling data. We're going to talk about which polls you should be paying attention to, which states the candidates are focused on, and how all this is going to impact the fallout here in South Carolina and beyond. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So it's been 3 weeks since Hurricane Helene inflicted more than $225 billion of damage on the United States. Most of that damage in the mountains of western North Carolina, where entire communities literally washed off the map. Now, there was initial media coverage of this storm in western North Carolina, not as much as some would have preferred, but over the last few weeks, that coverage has, for the most part, dried up. Our outlet, however, has continued its focus on western North Carolina, trying to assess not only the physical damage, the property damage, but the loss of life associated with the storm. That process has not been without controversy, as our reporter Andy Fancher, who has made 3 trips to western North Carolina, spent more than a week on the ground in these mountain communities, has brought numbers that the mainstream media and some of the public have taken issue with. But before we get into the death toll, before we talk about some of those numbers, Andy, you've made 3 trips up there. You spent a week on the ground. Talk to us about what is the situation on the ground in western North Carolina right now. Are things better than immediately after the storm 3 weeks ago? Are they worse? Are they the same? What are you seeing on your most recent trips up to the mountains up there?
Sure. So what I'm seeing is western North Carolina frozen in time. So yes, I've had the ability to see a little bit of progression here in multiple counties that we've probed following a week after the storm. So yes, we've been on the ground non-consecutively for a week, spanning a 2-week period. So yeah, we have seen civilians, all right, pick up shovels. We've seen volunteers from as far as Los Angeles, from Boston, from Florida, showing up with anything and everything that they could possibly provide, whether that be excavators or skilled labor, what have you. And they, yes, they are cleaning up the mountains, but even then, even with this overwhelming response, there is still months, if not years, of work ahead of them.
You were talking earlier, we were chatting, you said access to certain places is slowly being reestablished, but you said a comment to me that kind of stuck in my head. You said certain areas of roads are being cleared, but not yet navigable. I mean, walk us through what you're seeing in terms of the infrastructure up there.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm traveling around in my beautiful sedan, my 12-year-old sedan, and I mean, yeah, it gets to certain parts where, okay, I have to turn around now. I certainly don't trust this vehicle to go up this road anymore, and the road certainly didn't look like that a month ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the infrastructure is decimated.
Are there parts of the state that are still being restricted? Access is still being restricted by?
Not that I have seen. By God's grace, we have seen most of the state, if not all of it, open up. But I can't speak for all of it. I haven't seen all of it. I've primarily, I've hyper-focused on Buncombe County at this moment. That's, of course, Asheville, Swannanoa. I mean, let's not forget Swannanoa. I mean, some people push back and counter that Swannanoa was hit worse than Asheville. Quite honestly, the only difference between Buncombe County and Baghdad is that Buncombe County has trees. I mean, and I know that's funny. That's a humorous analogy, but I don't think it's quite far off from the actuality of the circumstance, especially when you're talking to veterans out that way. We've seen an overwhelming response of local veterans between Air Force, Marines, Army. Hell, we've quoted some of those men ourselves. And that is what they're saying. And our mission has pretty much just been putting out as many testimonies as possible. I don't know if you've kind of picked up on that now.
Yeah.
I mean, if I encounter somebody, hey, can I take your photograph? Can I get some quotes? Tell me what you're seeing or what you're not seeing.
Right.
And let's get this story out.
And I want to ask you about that Buncombe County death toll here in a second. But before that, let's talk about you talk about the situation on the ground, improved a little perhaps. Has the reporting on this Appalachian apocalypse, this humanitarian disaster, has the reporting improved?
According to dozens upon dozens of volunteers and locals that we have quoted, that we've published, it's gotten worse.
How so?
Well, some folks are concerned, especially at this one base camp that just a magnificent site, Western Carolina Emergency Network. I wouldn't say they have collaborated, but they are a nonprofit that has begun working alongside Restoration Church. And what these folks are doing is they are literally saving lives in the wake of federals just standing around having joyrides on side-by-side vehicles. I mean, this is what everybody's saying that I speak with out that way.
This is the FEMA response.
The FEMA response. Here, in fact, let me tell you a little bit about my perspective on the FEMA response.
There's a lot
I've seen
of discussion
them once.
about FEMA.
For whatever my perspective is worth, I saw them once. I was standing with some folks who were volunteering. They were checking untagged vehicles, making sure that there were no bodies in these untagged vehicles. The vehicles are everywhere. They're up in trees. They're on roofs of houses. They're in houses. They're under mud. So I was walking with some folks, and we did a story on them as well. And one dude was standing up at the top of the hill, and he yelled out FEMA. So we poked our head up from under this hole, and there was a fleet of blacked out expeditions hauling ass. And that was my one and only time that I have seen FEMA in the 2 weeks that we have been up there.
Got to get to those lithium mines quick. Let me ask you this, though, Andy, and maybe as we talk about this, you can talk about that Buncombe County estimate.
Of course.
The latest one that you published. You did a story a little over a week ago, the first real death toll related to this, based with conversations with those on the ground who have handled these bodies, who have know these.
Citing a very, very official source who, unfortunately, we cannot name at this time, but it's not uncommon for us to cite official sources who are correct and leave them anonymous. So that's what we did 2 weeks ago when we cited that 500 number, which is still 2 times more than the official fatality count for all of Hurricane Helene, from Florida to North Carolina. And we've seen some resurrections on the official numbers because they've gone down, they've gone up, and then they've gone down again.
You had 8 Lazaruses, if I'm not mistaken.
At one point in time, it came to 30 resurrections.
But I want to push back a little bit, and I'll just play the devil's advocate
Sure.
of someone, in this post-truth world. A lot of folks have said, where are the receipts in terms of pictures of bodies?
Mm-hmm.
So they're asking us, why aren't we posting pictures of bodies? What do you say to that kind of criticism?
What I say to that is, when has the American public ever demanded to see photographs of bodies following a mass casualty event? All right. Did we demand to see 58 dead after Las Vegas? Did we demand to see those bloated and draped over chain link fences after Hurricane Katrina? So for that to suddenly be what is required to prove numbers that are being provided by first responders, by very official sources, some as high up as the pyramid could possibly go, it's absolutely ridiculous.
When you and I were talking earlier, you said something to me that really stood out. You were talking about how these really aren't our numbers. I mean, we're publishing the best numbers that we have from sources on the ground, but talk us through that. These aren't our numbers.
Sure, and just to speak a little bit more on the count, I mean, at this point in time, I have seen bodies, all right? I've certainly smelled death, and it's getting louder and louder by the day, and I can attest to that as somebody who's been up there multiple times, and quite honestly, just in speaking with volunteers, I most certainly am not a volunteer, I'm just a photographer, right? But we almost have a sense of guilt returning home after speaking with so many people who don't have one anymore. People who are still willing to give you the shirt off their back. So, yeah, it's certainly not my body. It's not my family member in the mud. It's not our numbers. This is This is Western North Carolina's numbers. This is Western North Carolina's tragedy, and nobody from mainstream media is talking about it.
Let me ask you this. This is kind of a politically sensitive question. You've been in Western North Carolina now, again, spent more than a week on the ground, multiple different trips. Early voting in North Carolina started 2 days ago, on October the 17th. North Carolina is a pivotal state in the upcoming presidential election, one of 7 battleground states, which will determine who holds power in the United States beginning in January 2025. Based on what you've seen, where are these folks going to vote? Are they going to be able to vote? And can you share, if anything, based on the people you talked to, who they plan on voting for?
So here's what I will say to that. We've got volunteer efforts, again, from 50 states, all right, that have consolidated themselves in Western North Carolina. And even these volunteers haven't reached some mountain communities. Even these volunteers are noting that entire towns are gone. So as they are finding people displaced, finding people dead from hypothermia after surviving the storm, all right, as they're finding folks, some literally waving flashlights and broken metal to get the attention of helicopters that remain steadfast and circling over Appalachia, I guarantee you the last thing on these displaced people's minds are, where am I going to vote? Yeah. All right. There were some folks that
Fair enough.
By some miracle, I refound them after finding them during our first trip. And one individual got a phone yesterday. So when you're without that kind of communication, again, I doubt the last thing on your mind is, where am I going to vote? But speaking on the political climate of Appalachia, I can tell you that everybody, just about everybody I've talked to, at least the locals, that is Trump country out that way. And I saw some mega flags fly before seeing any recovery efforts initiated. So as for where they're leaning, I don't think there's any question there. But as for how they'll be able to participate, that could be a problem.
Yeah. Well, I love that you made that observation. You know, one of the things that my wife said to me in watching some of the coverage of these citizens responding, veterans from all over the country, individuals giving of their time, of their resources to help these people. She said, imagine how much they could help if the government wasn't taking so much of their money in the first place. So.
And imagine how many more people would respond if MSM did their job and put into perspective the dire straits that Appalachia is in. It's been quite interesting in meeting so many people and talking with so many people. Obviously, you learn a little bit about yourself too. I mean, it's no secret that I used to work in mainstream media myself. I used to work for an NBC affiliate, and it's become so abundantly clear that I used to be a part of the noise, and only now, after resigning from the thing that I wanted to do my entire life, am I finally a part of the news.
Oh, yeah. Andy Fancher, everybody, keep us posted. I know you're going to be back up there. You've been talking with these folks now for 3 weeks. Your work in not only reporting on this, but in building this network of sources related to this tragedy. Andy, just can't thank you enough for the work you're doing. And I'm telling you, by the time this story is finally told, I think your work is going to be not only validated, but vindicated. Thank you, man.
Well, if there's one thing that I could sell here is anybody displaced by this storm, anybody who has lost loved ones, I encourage them. I mean, I encourage anybody watching this segment from out that way to reach out to me directly, Andy@FITSNews.com. I want to speak with you. I want to tell your story. In fact, we're efforting an interactive map now where we can put these fatalities into perspective. So if we've got viewers right now who can substantiate these fatalities, as we have been publishing the numbers we have, again, please reach out.
Absolutely. And one last thing, Andy, can you close with that line that you shared with me earlier?
Sure. I heard it first from Jordan Maxwell. I don't know if he was the official source of this quote, but it's something that has stuck with me in all of this media and online backlash and reporting on this story accurately. And it goes as follows. Don't trust the person who claims to have the facts, but instead listen to the person looking for the facts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Count on us to continue looking for those facts as we dig even deeper into the Appalachian apocalypse. So we're going to shift gears now and talk in our true crime segment about a case that has dominated headlines here in South Carolina and beyond. This is a story which has been picked up by multiple national outlets, and it involves the disappearance of a Broadway star, Zelig Williams, known as Z to his friends. This is a young man who has been in Hamilton. He's been in MJ the Musical. He toured with Hugh Jackman, just an incredibly talented young man. Went missing earlier this month, has not been seen in over 2 weeks now, I believe that's correct. As the search for Zelig Williams intensifies, our Callie Lyons has been on this case from the beginning. Callie, there were some developments this week in the case, but before we get to those, can you give our audience a background on the disappearance of Zelig Williams? How did we get here, Callie?
Certainly. Zelig went missing from his mother's home where he had been staying on the morning of October the 3rd. And a few minutes after he left, somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes after he left home, his mother received word that an SOS ping had been sent out from his phone. And really, that's the last that anyone has heard from Zelig. His car was located the next day on October the 4th at a parking spot near Palmetto Trail. And the trail has kind of gone cold at this point. There's been a lot of searching going on, but no word, no sight. There's been nothing from him.
Callie, let me ask you a question. You referenced that SOS ping on his phone. I guess two questions. Did that ping occur where the car was found or at a different location? And have they found his phone?
As far as we know, they have not found his phone. Now, that's according to the Richland County Sheriff's Office. But the ping happened in a different location, about 20 miles from where his car was found, and much closer to his home.
There was a press conference this week by the Richland County Sheriff's Department, Sheriff Leon Lott, convening that gathering. And some of the language in that press conference, a lot of folks who are following this case, a lot of folks who knew Z, who are concerned for his well-being, listen closely to some of that language. The sheriff talked about closure. And so there were those who were speculating that that indicated perhaps evidence or information that it had been made available to investigators that perhaps Zelig's body this was a search for a deceased individual, not a missing person. Callie, what do you know about those statements and that line of inquiry? Do we think Zelig Williams is alive or dead? And did the police have anything one way or the other?
Well, that's a really good question because the sheriff did open the press conference by saying he wanted to give the family closure. And of course, we take that to mean something very specific. But then when asked, he said there's no evidence. So we really have no evidence one way or the other what has happened to Zelig at this point in time.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Callie. Obviously, the family very much involved in the search for Zelig Williams. There were statements made by a private investigator who was on the case at the behest of the family. Those statements not entirely in alignment with what the sheriff's department has said. Callie, do you sense some, I don't know if tension's the right word, but some distance perhaps between investigators hired by the family and the sheriff's department? What's the deal with that?
Certainly. The private investigator, Chandra Cleveland, said that she called the sheriff's department and they are working together on the case. But the sheriff's department says they're not working with anyone. The other difference is two very different areas of focus. The sheriff's department is clearly focused on searching the area near Palmetto Trail where his car was located. And the PI is clearly focused on the location of that ping from his cell phone, about 20 miles away.
So that's interesting. So not only do they have potentially different focuses of immediate interest, but there's perhaps different, angles of where they think the investigation is going. I noticed the investigator at one point said that if he were meeting someone he chatted to online, she was going to find out who that was. That was something that folks had indicated was a possibility, perhaps an online connection gone wrong. But Callie, I wanted to ask you this. I read the press release from both Richland County and the private investigator, and it seemed that in the Richland County Sheriff's Department release, as you mentioned, it's a crime investigation. It's a missing person investigation. In the release issued by the PI, it felt to me that it was more of a narrative control document referring to Zelig's Christian faith, talking about him going to different churches in the area, and that if anyone at these churches had seen him, that they should reach out not to the sheriff's department but to the private investigator. That to me seemed curious. What are your thoughts on the release sent by the PI?
That's definitely true. There is a lot of work at play on the narrative. He was a very spiritual being and going through some spiritual struggles that actually led him to leave Broadway last December, which is interesting because he was an original cast member on MJ the Musical. So, in other words, he was where he had dreamed of being since he was a very little kid. But he left for some spiritual reason. And there are hints in his podcast and the comments that he's made online that he was going through some spiritual struggles. So, definitely a big part of his personality and his focus, especially these past months that he's been home in Colombia. Now, the sheriff's department has said very little about that. They're not searching churches for Zelig. They're looking at the
Right.
Palmetto Trail very specifically. So, yeah, we have two very different stories here. It'll be interesting to see what story's closer to the truth.
Absolutely. And again, we can talk about him. It's been talked about. It was referenced in your excellent background coverage, Callie. He's a young man who apparently had questions about sexuality. It was something that was not a secret to those who knew him. And so obviously that is something that the family clearly has been attempting to downplay as this search continues. And so, again, Callie, you've done amazing reporting, not only pulling previous legal filings, but again, following this investigation at every step of the way. Just can't commend you enough. Callie, keep us in the loop on this story. This is, again, is one that has attracted a ton of attention. Clearly, an incredibly talented young man, but obviously a young man that, as you mentioned, was struggling. And so, how all of that played into this disappearance, we don't know yet. But Callie, you've done amazing work. Also, real quick, want to thank our friends at Bamberg Legal. They have for years now sponsored our Unsolved Carolinas series, which shines a light on not only high-profile cases like this one, but cases which have run cold. So I can't thank Justin Bamberg and his crew enough for supporting those efforts, which help us share these stories. But I want to bring our Jen Wood in now. Jen, on the true crime front this week, several big stories on FITSNews. There were updates in the Jessica Barnes case. You filed a report on a murder case out of Texas that had a South Carolina connection. But I wanted to focus on a connection between those two cases that not a lot of other folks have picked up on, but you did an amazing report on this regarding the fact that these were both murders by strangulation, according to investigators, and that South Carolina is the only state in America which does not have a standalone strangulation law as part of its domestic violence statutes. Jen, walk us through this strangulation issue, and if you would, based on the sources you've spoken to, what are they saying makes the case for this law?
So yeah, it's, these are always difficult stories to cover, and when you cover more than one in a 2-week period, you start to question, what can we do better? Like, are there things we can do to prevent this? And I had been speaking with Brian Bennett, who's a retired law enforcement criminal justice trainer, who is now a vocal advocate for strangulation legislation. And he was very, very helpful in educating me on, that's what he does now, is he goes around the country and trains medical professionals, legal professionals, and law enforcement on strangulation, recognition, prevention, and, proceeding through the legal system. So it was really helpful in educating me on the specifics of strangulation as a form of assault, and especially in terms of intimate partner violence. And what I didn't realize is South Carolina is the only state that does not have legislation, laws specific to strangulation as a form of assault. All other 49 states have it. And what that means is if, somebody strangles another person, it is a felony. It's classified a felony. And, when we were talking about it, it, occurred to me, one of the questions I asked him was, to me, this is anytime you take your hands and attempt to keep somebody from breathing, that is attempted murder. I mean, the potential outcome could be that they die. I'm like, why aren't they all charged like that? And he said, you have to prove intent. So the problem that we're running into in South Carolina is with these types of assaults, there's different ways to charge them, and they're not charged consistently. They can be charged as a misdemeanor. They can be charged assault first degree, assault second degree, and then they often get pleaded down. So plea deals are taken, and there's no way to track it. There's no way to track those crimes, which is really interesting when you look at the fact that a lot of research has been done recently on strangulation as an indicator for murder. A domestic violence victim who has been strangled is 700 times more likely to die by homicide.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, there's a lot of things, law enforcement, police action shootings. So officer involved shootings, we write about those
All the time,
weekly,
yeah.
all the time. Those are the individuals that are involved in those. The suspects are oftentimes domestic violence. They oftentimes have a prior history of strangulation. So if, if police officers are responding to a call of a situation where there's domestic violence and they're looking at a criminal background of the person who lives there and they see strangulation, they can be prepared. They can be prepared walking into that situation that it could potentially be deadly. It could save lives of law enforcement officers. It's also a predictor of mass murderers. Most mass murderers have a history of strangulation. So yeah, I mean, it was just a fascinating conversation. And me, I like to really objectively look at, I know when you're going to pass legislation, there are pros, there are cons, there's, this is why this possibly could be a problem. And what I could not find a reason that, even if we get the most basic legislation passed, I can't find a downside to it. All it would do would make South Carolina safer.
Certainly. And obviously, South Carolina does have a statute. It's not a statute, it's part of a statute in which impeding the airflow of a victim is an aggravating factor for domestic violence of various degrees. But Jen, as you pointed out, it is just an aggravating factor. It is not part of the code itself. And certainly there is tremendous discretion regarding bumping that up or down. And certainly I'm not saying that prosecutors shouldn't have discretion in these matters, but I think your point is, hey, if we have an actual charge related to this that someone is charged with, at the very least initially, that's something that can highlight it, something that can draw attention to it, so that again, when, as you're saying, those cops, when they're pulling that rap sheet up, going to a home with a potential active shooter, they know, hey, this guy's got a strangulation rap, or this person, it doesn't have to be a guy, they know going into that person is going to be more likely to be disposed to violent acts. I agree. Hard to see the downside to it, provided, again, it's got the same sort of protections in the other statutes. Jen, let me ask you this, though. You've talked about this in connection with two big cases, Jessica Barnes' case obviously being one. This is the 20-year-old from Pendleton, South Carolina, went missing on August the 2nd, and we found out just this month that she had been strangled to death by her husband, 20-year-old Brandon Barnes, on August the 2nd. Barnes and his co-conspirators, two young women who were living with him and his wife at a pool house in Pendleton. Apparently, not only did one of them witness this murder, but they both conspired to help dispose of Jessica Barnes' remains. But there's another case, Jen, out of Houston, Texas. Tell us about that case. It's got a South Carolina connection, but it also involves a strangulation death. Am I correct?
Yeah, so Krista Gilly, 38 years old. She's a Somerville native, graduated from Clemson, and was married to Lee Gilly, also a South Carolina native, also a Clemson grad. They lived in Houston, Texas, and they have two young, beautiful children. Upscale neighborhood, $100 million home.
Perfect life.
Perfect life. Perfect life. She was 9 weeks pregnant, and on October 7th at 11:30 p.m., Lee Gilly called 911 and requested EMS because his wife had attempted suicide by overdose. EMS arrived, transported her to the hospital. The hospital staff noticed obvious injuries on Krista. And she died, unfortunately, and they ordered an autopsy. The autopsy found that she had died by strangulation. So he has been charged with capital murder because, in Texas, that is one
Yeah,
of their
that's the
charges.
top.
Yep.
That's the highest.
And she was nine weeks pregnant. And just, it's sad. Her family is, out there. They just set his bond yesterday at $1 million. I have to check again today. At last I checked, he had not posted bond, and ordered him to stay away from the children. But those children are 1 and 3 years old. They don't have a mother. She was a physical doctor of physical therapy. She was adjunct professor. She was beautiful. Just a light. Everybody describes her as just a caregiver. And I don't know. I have a lot of FOIAs out in that. I have FOIAs out for the 911 call from Texas, FOIAs out for prior calls for service to their address, checking in South Carolina. So I don't know if there was a history of domestic violence. But, in talking to people who knew her, I get the impression that there could have been. So it'll be interesting to see. Now, Texas does have strangulation legislation. So not saying that this would have saved her, but it certainly shows how this can affect anybody. This, from 20-year-old Jessica Barnes, who lived in Pendleton, to 38-year-old Krista Gilly, who, lived in $1 million home in Texas. It's a scary crime.
Yeah, it cuts across all socioeconomic strata, certainly. And Jen, you mentioned earlier that there was no prior instances of alleged domestic violence in the Gilly case, but Lee did say to police that they had been fighting that night, that they had had an argument. And again, we don't know the details of that, and certainly we're not going to jump to any conclusions. We're going to let your Freedom of Information Act request and our team's investigation take us where it leads us. But Jen, just another case that we're going to be keeping a close eye on. Well, speaking of cases we've been covering, since I've got you both here, we have to update our audience on the status of the Micah Miller case, particularly some impending civil actions that we hear are imminent against John Paul Miller, the pastor at the heart of this still swirling scandal and saga there in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Obviously, Micah Miller, our news outlet, exclusively reported in early May on her suspicious suicide back on the 27th of April of this year. That story continuing just to drive all sorts of protests, proposed legislative changes, criminal investigations. But now we are getting to the meat of it, the civil lawsuits. Jen or Callie, either one of you, what are we hearing on these civil lawsuits? When are they coming, and what might they entail?
We're hearing they are very imminent. There are multiple civil lawsuits that will be filed, and that they are tied to allegations of sexual assault by John Paul Miller. And surprisingly, also one of them could likely include his father.
And Callie, you've done some reporting on this pastor daddy, JP's father, Reginald Wayne Miller. Is that correct? I got the name right?
Yeah. He has somewhat of a sordid history. And I know there are people who have been waiting a very long time to see what the language of these lawsuits will include, where he's concerned.
Well, obviously, as soon as we get our hands on any filed motions related to this case, we will provide our audience with an update. But certainly, we are told those suits are imminent. Count on FITSNews, which has been covering this story again from the very beginning, to keep our audience up to speed on the very latest developments in the Micah Miller saga. So we spoke earlier about early voting in North Carolina, which started again 2 days ago, October 17. Early voting here in South Carolina starts on Monday, this coming Monday, the 21st of October. All of these signs that we are getting incredibly close now to Election Day, Tuesday, the 5th of November, 2024. An incredibly consequential election, just like the last one, just like the one before it. It seems like Dylan Nolan, every year we hear it's the most consequential election in American history. This one certainly, I'd argue, perhaps there's some merit to that hyperbole. But I want to start with swing states like North Carolina, like Arizona, like Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia. For weeks now, Kamala Harris has enjoyed small leads in these states, along with a lead nationally in the polls. Over the last few weeks, though, we have seen the ground shift a bit. Donald Trump now starting to overtake her in most, if not all, I think now the latest real clear polling averages, Donald Trump, again, small leads, but ahead in all of these battleground states. Let me ask you this. As we look at these states, what polls should we be paying attention to? Which pollsters should we be looking at? And help us make sense of these numbers that we're seeing with Donald Trump now inching ahead.
It's interesting because if you look at, okay, who was the best pollster in the last election? That would be the midterms, 2022. The Republican-leaning pollsters who predicted a red wave, obviously that never materialized. If you look at who's currently controlling the legislature, the GOP has a narrow majority in the House and does not have control of the Senate. However, if you look at the last presidential election, the GOP-leaning pollsters were the ones who were a lot closer to the final numbers, whereas the MSM and or nonpartisan pollsters were the ones who were farther off the mark. If you believe that this presidential election is going to play like Trump's previous two presidential elections, it's highly likely that pollsters aren't able to take into account his whole voter base. And that's because a lot of the people who Trump is relying on in his coalition are folks who don't traditionally vote. So they're folks who are less likely to be contacted by pollsters.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question. We looked at Trump's schedule. Obviously, he's been in Illinois, went to California this past weekend, did a big rally there. He's got a rally scheduled for New York City on the 27th of October. Also, a Colorado trip. Illinois, California, New York, Colorado, those are states Joe Biden won going away, in some cases by more than 20%. What does it say to you that Trump is spending time in these non-battleground states?
I think Colorado and California are definitely interesting. I think President Trump's connection to New York, that being his home state, I think playing MSG, it's almost like he's a rock star. He wants to play MSG. It's going to cost him a lot of money to do it. I don't think that he thinks he's going to flip New York. However, I think on election night, we might see New York be a lot closer than a lot of folks in the Democrat Party would like it to be. I think it will be within 10 points.
Mm-hmm. And also some have speculated there are congressional races in some of these states that they may not be red states, but there are potentially some congressional
the down ballot implications. And I know that you've got connections with folks who have some insight into these matters that aren't public. And you've been hearing some things about the internals. Do you care to share any of that?
Well, yeah, I posed this very question to some folks in Trump world, actually folks that were down in Palm Beach at the moment that we were digging into this stuff. And I asked them, what's he doing going to these places? You must be seeing some good numbers. And the response was, quote, "You have no idea." And I want to make sure I'm getting this right. They said, "We're killing her in the battlegrounds and competitive in places we shouldn't be." Do you buy that narrative, Dylan? Do you think that MAGA internal polls are showing a potential electoral romp?
Yeah, and that's because I listen to Pod Save America, which is the far left cast of the folks that used to work in Obama's administration, have had roles in Democrat administrations since then, and who are very tight with Kamala's campaign. And they had a Harris campaign official on who said that their own internal polling shows that all of the swing states are margin of error, which, that's alarm bells going off in their camp. Uh, the message of the day there was there's this fight is still winnable, and I would agree. I think that, margin of error means margin of error, but it is completely believable that the public polling is not yet reflecting the full nature of Trump's support. Harris's own campaign official cited his belief that the public polling will, in the weeks leading up to the election, tighten up, saying that they have known since early September that the state of this race is on a knife's edge.
Yeah. And on a knife's edge in, again, multiple key states. And I do want to point out, we talked about Trump making these trips to these deep blue states. He's not obviously neglecting swing states. In fact, we were looking at his schedule. He was in Michigan last night. He's in Pennsylvania today and Sunday. He's got 2 days in North Carolina coming up, and we'll be headed to Georgia also next week, in addition to an event in Las Vegas. So he's not neglecting these core swing states at all. But any day that's spent away from these battlegrounds kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly a day that could have been spent in these battlegrounds. And it's interesting listening to, once again, staffers on both sides who are speaking with the media, talking about ground operations in Pennsylvania. Democrats have like 400 staffers on the ground. I think Republicans are somewhere near that number, and both are planning to surge in a quick reaction force here in the last couple of days to go hit as many doors as possible. Republicans are stating that they're trying to hit 500,000 doors, and I'm sure that Democrats are trying to do the same thing.
When we look at these polling numbers, obviously polls coming out every minute these days. Swing states, those averages keep moving a bit. But let me ask you this question. We're talking about the numbers, the raw numbers that we're seeing, and clearly the race shifting toward Donald Trump here as Election Day approaches. But I want to ask you the really important question. Why are those numbers moving in Trump's favor the closer we get to Election Day? Are undecideds finally making up their minds? What's your take on why these numbers are moving, Dylan?
I mean, we saw Harris have a real bump when everybody was thrilled that Joe Biden, who, it was initially thought had a way worse chance than her at winning this election, was off the ticket. I don't think that she's performed as well as a candidate as many within her own party would want. I think it's arguable that Biden would have a better chance of winning the key state of Pennsylvania. He definitely has built up a reputation with the blue-collar folks who work there and who are a very important voting bloc there. I don't think that she had the big win at the debate. She had the big win at the convention. And I think since then, I don't know an event that has really went in her favor.
Mm-hmm. She hasn't sealed the deal, in other words, with a lot of these undecided voters.
And there's still time for her to do that. There's still time for her to get another big win. But at this point, it's incumbent upon her to do that.
Well, she's got $1 billion in the bank to help get that win, a huge financial edge. Will that come into play?
It's interesting. You see, they obviously have very deep coffers. It's to the point where they don't even talk about their fundraising levels anymore, because it's like, okay, if you're going to be the party that's talking about taking away the money from the billionaires and the corporations, well, then you're receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the billionaires and corporations. That doesn't look great. But they're producing these advertisements, which I'm not sure are landing. I saw a news story talking about how Democrat operatives are cautioning against putting Donald Trump in the ads because their internal polling is telling them that voters are actually reacting positively in favor of Trump when they look at these negative ads, which are supposed to cut Trump down. Now, that's a difficult position to spend your $1 billion if, when you're trying to cut your opponent down, it's actually increasing the amount that people like him.
Yeah, and also let's not forget Joe Biden not really doing Kamala Harris any favors, linking her inextricably to his administration, to their administration, and saddling her with his accomplishments. Also, former President Bill Clinton this past week didn't do Harris any favors, talking about one of these murders that took place in Georgia, committed allegedly by an illegal immigrant. Clinton said this young woman would have been safe in her dorm room were it not for the current immigration policies. And I think Donald Trump came out and said, I approve that message. Dylan, as the race narrows, as undecideds, the handful of them that there are, finally start making up their mind, what issues do you think are driving their decisions? Is it immigration? Is it the economy? What is it?
I mean, if you look at what pollsters are telling us, the economy is the number one issue, immigration just behind it. Something that I would not have expected 5 years ago is that the majority of Americans say they support mass deportations. So that issue, and if you look, Kamala Harris was recently on a Univision town hall where she tacked to the right on the immigration issue. The traditional Democrat talking point for the last 10 years has been talking about how these people are necessary for our economy, how it would be completely impractical to, deport these people. Well, they've looked at the same polling that show that the majority of Americans support mass deportations, and they know that they won't get into office if they completely, run counter to that in their narratives. So she is tacking right on the immigration issue, and I think that tells you a lot.
Yeah. What was it, that famous French saying, I must find where my people are going so that I can lead them? Let me ask you this, Dylan. We're talking about Kamala Harris tacking to the right. There was a significant development in the...
I'm in a Mike Pence moment here. We got a fly in the studio.
So we're talking about Kamala attacking to the right, Dylan. There was a big issue this week. Israel successfully taking out one of the leaders of Hamas, its top target, in fact, the mastermind of the October 7, 2023 terrorist attack. Kamala Harris came out and basically took a victory lap for this Israeli operation, which incidentally she opposed when it was first launched. Let me ask you this. Forget the hypocrisy. Obviously, we expect that from politicians of all parties, unfortunately, but forget the hypocrisy. Let's talk about the pragmatism politically of this. Michigan, a state where there's a significant voting Muslim population, a state where Kamala has fallen behind in recent days. And just this week, we published an article how many in the Arab American community are encouraging her to distance herself from the Biden administration in its support of Israel. What was she thinking coming out and praising this operation? What's the strategy here?
I mean, you're obviously looking at this from a right-wing coded perspective. I was at the gym running on the treadmill the day that story happened, and I saw the headlines on the mainstream media, on the televisions in the gym, and the headline is, Harris calls for end of Gaza war after killing of Sinwar.
A little mission accomplished action.
Indeed.
So that's the play.
Yeah, and, Bibi Netanyahu has come out very publicly and said that this is not the end of the operation in Gaza. Now, what will he choose to do? I think that they're facing a lot of problems on their northern border with Hezbollah that they're trying to address, and they still haven't gotten back at Iran for the ballistic missile strike, which they've promised they will. I think that hostilities are going to escalate there. However, I don't know that they're going to be putting the majority of their resources into Gaza. However, I think that they're also not going to pull out.
Well, Dylan, obviously coming up on it now, 2.5 weeks away. Also, for those of you who follow our election coverage, we will be doing an election night live broadcast. Be sure to tune in. We'll have invited guests. We'll be analyzing results as they come in and also talking about fallout from this election, because 2024 will be a huge domino that impacts politics here in South Carolina, particularly if former President Donald Trump prevails in that election on November 5th. So be sure to tune in election night as FITSNews brings you our election night live broadcast. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, especially want to thank those of you who subscribe to FITSNews.com. It's only $8 a month, and your subscription empowers everything we do here, all of our work, seeking to hold those in power accountable. I also want to thank Victoria Smith, Victoria's Verdict. If you're down in the low country of South Carolina, and you need legal advice, particularly if you've been in an auto accident, Victoria's Verdict, call Victoria Smith Legal. She's got you covered. As we get closer to the election and all these true crime stories we follow, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com for the very latest. We'll catch you next week on the Week in Review.